Good afternoon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you have enjoyed your lunch and your coffee and dessert. My name is Steve Radelet. I'm a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development here in Washington, also an economic advisor to the government of Liberia, and I want to welcome all of you here this afternoon. I'm really pleased. When I saw the weather outside, and it's Friday afternoon, I thought there might be about 6 or 7 of you here this afternoon. So I want to thank you all for staying for this session. When this session ends, we want you to stay right in your seat. We're going to have a quick change of stage up here for the session that follows with Muhammad Yunus. And, so stay right where you are when this session ends. But it's my honor and privilege to introduce this afternoon's session on a case study of an integrated approach on policy, investment, and philanthropy in post-conflict zones. We've got a great panel to speak on this topic that come from several different perspectives on engaging with and supporting post-conflict situations. Our first speaker is the Honorable Natty B. Davis, who's the Minister of State without portfolio for the Republic of Liberia, who I have the great pleasure of working with on a very regular basis. As such, he's the lead government official charged with donor coordination, both official donors, private donors, and other donors, and he's charged also responsible for coordinating Liberia's poverty reduction strategy, which is a great blueprint of the government's strategy for poverty reduction, which can be found on the government's website. He's also the executive branch main liaison with the legislature, and in the early 1990s, he served as Deputy Minister of Commerce, as well as the Ministry of Finance, Economic and Financial Management Committee. So Minister Davis has extensive experience on this and can speak about these issues from the perspective of a government, obviously in Liberia, that's coming out of a horrendous conflict situation, the conflict there ending in 2003, and since then, the beginnings of a very strong and remarkable recovery. Our second speaker comes at this from the perspective of a foundation. Peter Buffett is the co-chair of the NoVo Foundation. In his spare time, he's also a well-established musician, as many of you had the pleasure of finding out last night, a composer and producer as well. He began his career in San Francisco writing music for commercials. He won an Emmy Award for his CD Ojibwe, which was released on his own label, Bison Head, and his theatrical production, Spirit, the Seventh Fire, was located on the National Mall down the road here for the Smithsonian's opening of the National Museum of the American Indian, and I saw that production, and it was great fun. It was wonderful, actually. It's always fun to have things out on the mall, so we're very pleased to have Peter with us today. Our third speaker will come at this from the perspective of an NGO working on the ground. Olara Otunnu is from Uganda. He's the president of the LBL Foundation for Children, a New York-based international organization devoted to promoting education and hope for children, particularly in poor, disadvantaged, and post-conflict communities. He was elected in 2006 to be the very first World Children's Ombudsman from a worldwide network of 12 million children. And he served as the UN Undersecretary General and Special Representative for Children in Armed Conflict from 1998 to 2005. He was also the president of the International Peace Academy from 1990 to 1998. So we're very delighted to have Mr. Otunnu with us today. And our fourth speaker, Rachel Kyte, comes at this from the perspective of the official donors and the private sector. She's the Vice President for Business Advisory Services at the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. Ms. Kyte joined the IFC in 2000 as a senior specialist ombudsman in the Office of the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman, and in 2004 she became the Director for Environment and Social Development, where she led the introduction of performance standards and IFC sustainability and disclosure policies. So we're very pleased to have this panel that can grapple with this issue of how to best and most effectively support post-conflict situations from several different perspectives. After each of them speak, we'll open it up to questions and answers, and you'll be able to raise your hand, and we've got 3 or 4 microphones that will rove around, and we'll ask you to identify yourself and raise specific questions for the speakers. So let's get right to it, and let's start with Minister Natty B. Davis.
I just had to move all of my instruments, telephones and things like that. But thank you very much, Steve. Let me take the opportunity also to thank the organizers and thank everyone who's here in this room. It's actually very humbling, appreciating that Liberia, going through what we've gone through and where we are now, being spotlighted and showcased in this way, and an opportunity to be able to share with you what we are doing as far as moving ourselves away from conflict and moving ourselves towards a more sustainable path in our development. And really getting an appreciation. I mean, I've learned so much, and the education that I've gotten just over the last few days of being here, that there's so many people within the world that are trying to do wonderful and incredible things, and how some of those things that they're trying to do can actually touch our lives and the people and the people of Liberia. It's really, really extremely appreciative, and let me at least make sure that I say that. I've asked them to just go back and forth on this graph. It's a graph that when we were at the Partners Conference in Berlin last year, again, we thought that it's quite revealing when you have it, because it speaks volumes of so many different things that have happened between that period and now, recording some of the sharpest and most significant drop in GDP for a country. And if you look at the numbers where you see per capita was at $800 in around 1972, and those are $1972. To where they are now, slightly under, or I think that right now slightly above $200. And today's dollars, that gives you an appreciation of the significant change that has taken place in Liberia over the years, and as a result of war. And one critical thing that this speaks to, that you don't see, is the loss of people. And the loss of capacity. I mean, I always say we've done a good job, all of us as Liberians, in actually destroying our country, and we must all take responsibility for that. We've done a wonderful job in that, and if we can do a wonderful job in rebuilding a country, we would do that. I think we will have much to our credit to do so. But people have left Liberia. A lot of people left. A lot of people who were trained and who had been developed over the years to run institutions, engineers, doctors, and all of those. This graph demonstrates to you that they have left, because those people would not be now today working for $200 to $300 a month. So they are in different countries, working in a number of different fields. And so that poses a significant challenge to any government that's beginning to try to recover. Let me just share with you, since the topic that we're speaking on covers both policy investments and philanthropy intervention, let me speak more on the broad frame on the policy initiatives. Many of you may be familiar with Liberia's history. I wouldn't take the time to try to go into that now, because I think there's literature out there that you may be able you should be able to find out and get an appreciation of Liberia's history. However, 3 years ago, Liberia did democratically elect the first woman's president in Africa, and who herself is a very dynamic leader that inherited a country that has been very, very broken down. Usually, you will find that when the country has gone through that kind of situation, institutions have been diminished. And I'm not just talking about the physical institutions. I'm talking about those institutions that protect rights, those institutions that ensure transparency, those institutions that ensure the proper management of government and governance and so forth. All of those were pretty much destroyed and have been affected as a result of the war. So what is critical then, usually when you have that kind of situation is leadership. Leadership then becomes extremely key and extremely critical in that kind of environment to make sure that you begin to try to start to see how do you lay the foundation for rebuilding those institutions. Fortunately, I think one thing that the Liberian people can say to their credit is that they did go to the polls and they did elect a leader who could provide the kind of vision and the kind of leadership to begin to start working our way out of the situation we find ourselves. But broadly, from a policy standpoint, we have a leadership that has recognized that in the long term, it's not a question of her, and it's not a question of me, and it's not a question of our individual efforts, but it's a question of the institutions, rebuilding and restoring those institutions that protect rights, that ensure that services are delivered, that ensure that government systems operate to the benefit of its people, and that there is accountability and transparency in the management and affairs of government. And again, there are a number of things that we have done to begin to go along that path of rebuilding those institutions, from the beginning all the way from the budget process and making sure that the whole budget process is a more transparent process with a lot of dialogue and a lot of civil society and public intervention, to to new public financial management laws, to improve procurement and new procurement laws, to an independent Office of Auditor General, to improving the different institutions of justice, the judicial systems, the court systems, to trying to upgrade and again put in not only just prosecuting attorneys but defense attorneys to begin to address those issues, those intractable issues associated with land and associated with equity. We have recently completed a 3-year strategy that basically it's embraced within what one would refer to as a poverty reduction strategy, but in a more localized, homegrown way, it is a Lift Liberia strategy, and that strategy focuses on the first 3 years. What are some of those fundamental things that we need to do as a government to begin to try to ensure that we're shoring up, building those sustainable institutions, so that as many of us leave the scene, that those institutions are there to ensure that there's continuity in terms of what we've been able to try to do, and there's sustainability in that effort. And it's critical that we do that, because although most of you here and many others throughout this world have responded in a very positive way to Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and the personality of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and really the vision of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, we would like to see, as we go over time, to see that response actually migrate into a response to Liberia and the people of Liberia, and how you support that. And we need to be able to give you that assurance that even where Ellen Johnson is not around many years from now, that you will have the institutions and the processes and procedures will be there in Liberia that you can continue to count on and trust and depend on, that your assistance and your help will continue to be meaningful. And that's where we focus on those policies, and recognizing that government is at the center of it. I mean, if you don't have a government that is willing to be responsive to its people, then the efforts that will be made by your different partners will not find its course. And so for us, developing the right policy environment has been the focus for the first 3 years. And I will invite all of you to visit the Executive Mansion website, emansion.gov.lr. You will have an opportunity to look at our poverty reduction strategy. You will therefore have the opportunity to see what it is that the plans that we've put in place and where we are going. And you will have an opportunity to see how you may be able to identify the areas that you might be able to get involved and support us. Lastly, let me just share with you, because we've recognized that many of you here are interested in assisting, we have created also a philanthropy secretariat under my office, which we understand is quite new and novel. But our effort in that regard is to try to be facilitative and also to try to see how we can provide information sharing across the board for those who are currently operating in Liberia and how they may learn of others who are doing good things in Liberia and how maybe perhaps you may find an entry point to come on board and be able to support our effort. So let me stop there. Let me make sure that I don't go over my 10 minutes and really try to hold that we can use that time to respond to your specific questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Davis. Peter Buffett.
Thank you. Thanks for having me up here as well. I tried to talk him into getting a piano up here so I could feel more comfortable saying what I need to say, but that didn't work out. A number of years ago, Gene Sperling pointed out that there's often rescue dollars and there's often development dollars, but there's rarely what I guess I'd call stability dollars. The time when the rescue is supposedly over, but there's not enough stability for development. And he pointed to Liberia as a perfect example of a place where that was present then. That was a few years ago. And we were all at the foundation very interested in that, of course, because we're so supportive of women leadership and girls in the world. Having a democratically elected woman leader kind of tipped the scales, I guess, if anything would have. And as Minister Davis pointed out yesterday at breakfast, that when Ellen Johnson Sirleaf shows up in a room of African leaders, it changes the dynamic, which is tremendous. So we support her, but we support the country. I mean, it really is about the people. I'm a big believer in surface area. That's where things stick, if there's a lot of surface area. And that's not going to happen with just the leader. You've got to really connect with the people and get them engaged as well. And it's not so easy. I think the secretary position is something we are a big believer in with Humanity United, Daphne Foundation, and others. We're supporting this position because we feel it's really critical for everybody to, first of all, know what everybody else is doing, but also get the government really engaged in what we're doing and knowledgeable, because that's the only way it's going to last. The whole idea is to do things that the government feels pushes their agenda forward, so we have something that's there when we're gone. And so that's been a really important part, and that really leads to the idea that I think we feel that if you don't pay attention to all what I would consider to be sort of three streams of development simultaneously, something can get lost. I mean, you have to pay attention to what the government's needs are and also advocate on behalf of issues that you think are important to get your work done on the ground. You have to pay attention to the private sector, find out where the economic opportunities lie for the people you're trying to support and what the government needs. And then, of course, the people themselves, the civil society, where that's if it doesn't grow authentically from the ground, it's not going to stick. So those three sectors all really need to be paid attention to. And so, for instance, when we're talking about education, we'll go in and we'll say education, that's the key, that's important. And then what I've learned, if anything, in these number of years now, is that there's always something behind the thing. You know, you think you're going in and you got the idea and it's going to be great. And then you go, and I always promote going. I came back from Liberia and realized you don't know if you don't go. You know, you just have to be on the ground. And you realize that it's not education per se. Of course, that's the most important thing. But girls aren't getting into secondary school because either there's not a latrine for them when they get their period. They are the economic engine at home, so they are asked to stay home so they can get the wood and do the cooking and take care of an elder or something like that. They get married off, cultural things happen, or somebody's trading sex for grades, which we saw. We saw a woman in a classroom there just to monitor that very issue. So education's great, but there's like 6 things behind it that you end up learning have to be taken into account before you can actually succeed at the goal. So really connecting to that and going, listening. You heard me talk last night about philanthropic colonialism, this idea that, hey, we got this great idea and it's going to work for you. is just wrong. You know, the people know the answers to the issues and the problems they face. And so really listening is critical for us. And then the other aspect of our work, so we have a lot of work going on in education, specifically adolescent girls, but also with vocational training. Again, you pay attention to what the market needs. Vocational training sounds great when you've got child soldiers that may be 18 or 20 that can't necessarily be put into a classroom with 8-year-olds or 10-year-olds. Get them vocational training. But if you're turning out tailors and we need plumbers, it makes no sense. So you have to pay attention, obviously, to the market, which is something we're doing with the Nike Foundation and the World Bank, which is very exciting. So I was going to say something else that was connected to that, and I completely forgot because I went off. But you know, it really is being in relationship to the place and realizing that the government is the first stop, making sure they know what's going on and they're connected to it, and that, you know, connects right through to the economic opportunities and the people on the ground. And I know I'll remember that last point and I'll get back to it, but I really do want to open it up for questions too, because it's important to hear the feedback. So I'm just going to move on.
We will reserve 1 minute when Peter has that.
Yeah, exactly, when that comes to me. Yeah,
Whatever
exactly.
that is. Mr. Otunnu, please.
Thank you very much, Steve. In approaching the question of recovery and rebuilding of a society torn by conflict, there are several policy considerations which are important. And for our purposes this afternoon, I'll only underscore 4. One, is a great temptation to seek to turn back the clock to the status quo ante. The stability, as we might think, before the conflict broke out. It's a grave mistake. Post-conflict is an opportunity to transform a society, to address the distortions that gave rise to the conflict in the first instance, particularly distortions of great gross inequalities within society, usually horizontally expressed as between different regions, different ethnicities, between rural and urban. So the occasion should be to transform, not to re-establish the status quo ante. Second consideration is to target in a very conscious way particular communities and particular sectors, the most affected communities and sectors. That is in part in order not to be so general and to be spread very thin, but also in part because it has the biggest impact when you do that and the greatest accountability in terms of what your support is doing. I would say, thirdly, it's a sad fact that war tends to engender a culture of dependency. The confidence of a people is shaken, their dignity is punctured, and their self-reliance is destroyed. So part of what should be the conscious strategy for rebuilding and for rehabilitation should be how to get this community back on its feet, psychologically, spiritually, culturally, to them to recover their sense of themselves, because only in that way can they move forward. And then, fourthly, I would say, one has to make sure that the intervention is strategic, that the points of entry is strategic. Again, because it makes the most impact and it affects the most people who have been affected by the conflict. Now, in the context of what I've said, at the operational level, I want to give one example of what I think is a very strategic intervention. In my work, I visited too many situations of conflict to recall, from Afghanistan to Sri Lanka to Colombia to Chechnya to Sudan to Burundi. It's a long and very sad list. But I'm struck by one fact among others. When I met those who were displaced, those who were so poor and were desperate, had nothing, I asked them, you need everything. But when I go back to New York, what should I tell the outside world you need most? And invariably, I was struck by their response, which was invariably, schools for our children. Schools for our children. And most of these would be parents who themselves never had the opportunity to see the inside of a classroom. But they were so invested in the prospect of their own children going to school, and this becoming the source of their own hope, and a sense that there is a future beyond the destruction left behind by war. But it has to be a particular concept and model of school, because we've seen the model up till now, by and large, has not worked. There are entities, official and philanthropic, in this room who have put a lot of money into education. Sadly, when you go to the ground, the impact does not begin to correspond in any way with the proportion of what has been invested. So we've got to look for different models of making this work. And in my view, it's got to be targeting a community-based school, managed by the community, deeply involved in the actual construction of the school and the running of the school. It's got to be a school that is offering not pro forma education. Our children get quality education. Why do we think that the children of the poor, the marginalized, and the vulnerable should settle for what is no education at all? So we've got to offer them quality education, especially at the primary, secondary level. I agree entirely with what the Aga Khan said yesterday. So the foundation is there, so they can dream and they can hope for something better. But in addition to offering quality education, there is something else the school should do. Because the school, when you say school, the parents are mobilized. A school for all their kids, regardless of ethnicity or religion. And the school can therefore become an engine of transformation for the community as a whole. For example, because the kids can't attend school because of waterborne diseases, you've got to address the issue of clean water. But whatever solution you come up with becomes the solution for the community as a whole. The issue of public health, similarly, the school may be the occasion to address it. But whatever answer you come up with becomes an answer for the community as a whole. And the school also can be the place where the parents go for their own education, for literacy, for vocational training. So the school mustn't be apart, but should be at the center of the community to mobilize the community to address the key issues which affects them and becomes transformative. You know, in my travels, I have to say, the good Lord has been very democratic in the distribution of sheer raw talent to children. How all of them, wherever I encountered them, are so inquisitive, they are hungry for knowledge, they have open spirit, they are intelligent. But the difference is between the kids where this raw talent is given the opportunity to develop and become something, and then the vast majority of kids who are condemned to a life of ignorance and despair and whose talents will simply wither because there's no opportunity to take them anywhere. That is what we've got to address. And that is what a model of school, the building and the construction and the concept of a school must be able to address. And that is the reason why I personally is devoting my time and my energy to the building of schools, a particular concept of school that fits into what I've just been outlining. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Otunnu. Rachel Kyte.
Thank you. I thought I should probably take a minute to explain a little bit how we work, which will put my comments on what we've found works and doesn't work in post-conflict situations into context, and then maybe talk precisely about some of our examples in Liberia. So we're the private sector lending arm of the World Bank Group, which means that we do three things. We invest directly in companies in developing countries. We offer both debt and equity. And we provide advice to companies and sectors about how to develop best practice and improve their operations so that the development impact is greater of that company's growth and success. But also to government on the measures that they can take that would support the private sector to flourish in a way that promotes development. And in the last few years, we've decentralized rapidly, and we have more than 60% of our staff outside of Washington, and we have staff on the ground in more than 108 countries. This was a deliberate strategy to be close to your client. If you don't know your client, you're not living day to day with your client, your advice, as well as your equity and your debt, is of less use. Last year, we lent for our own account $12 billion and mobilized about another $6 billion in the markets. And of that, 40% of it was in the least developed countries. 8% of our lending and our equity goes into post-conflict countries. There's about 40 of them in the world, as sort of defined by the World Bank. So with that in context, I think that we, along with many others in recent times, thought about the peace-building, reconstruction, development phases as something that was predominantly for the public sector. But we've learnt an awful lot about when and how one needs to focus on the private sector in that journey. And I think that the most important thing to think about is that the private sector doesn't disappear during the conflict. It just goes underground. Now, in most developing countries, the vast majority of private sector activity is completely informal, which means it's very hard for a government trying to reconstruct to get the benefit of all of that economic activity into its own systems for distribution and for investment as it plans for the future. Now, in a post-conflict situation, the vast majority of that private sector activity, from the micro-enterprise to the small enterprise to the medium enterprise, just goes underground as the fabric of society and economy fractures. So one of the most important things is to really think about what that means. And it goes to Olara's point about not trying to reconstruct the past. One of the most important things that we found is going in and really providing some enabling environment reforms at the government level that will allow a kind of private sector that never existed before to start to flourish in a post-conflict situation. So putting the laws in place to allow microfinance to operate, allowing microfinance institutions to take deposits so that savings can grow. These kinds of really fundamental building brick reforms we find are some of the first things that need to be done. Now, some of those private companies during the conflict go underground and they do things to survive. They become, in some part, perhaps part of the conflict and part of the problem. And this is something that you and we, as we go back in and as we invest, as we provide advice and as we work with partners, have to deal with. We have to deal with our own appetite for risk and reputation, etc., around working with those who at some point may have colluded or may have been part of a problem. And working through those issues and getting comfortable about how to approach that in a post-conflict situation is a very, very important part of what we do. So, for the way we look at it is, who's the management team today? What is their vision of the future? What is the company's vision of how it's going to govern itself? What are they doing with the money, etc.? You know, how can we move forward? The other thing we've learned is you talked about philanthropic colonialism. You cannot fly in and fly out. You have got to be there day in, day out. You've got to be in there day in and day out to work with the Ministry of Finance and with the Ministry of Economic Development, with the Ministry of Women, etc. But you've also got to be there in order to really understand the dynamic of the micro sector, of the small, medium-sized sector, and really to understand what's going on. So you've got to be boots on the ground in order to build a partnership. We've learned a lot about bringing microfinance in much earlier than was traditionally the case a few years ago. Microfinance can really be both a way in which to get the economy going in the rural areas, really seeing that wealth is being able to be grown and distributed across the country, terribly important when the rifts are horizontal, as Olara said. But also microfinance is a very, very good way to get cash into the hands of women and have that cash really working for livelihoods and incomes in a way which is sustainable for development. And then, and I was talking to Minister Davis about this before we came on stage, how do you identify the small, medium-sized enterprises and provide them both with liquidity and with access to finance, but also provide them with advice so that they can develop their business plans, become more robust? And how do you provide the capital markets that will allow them to grow? These are very important parts once the microfinance system's really there. Now, there's a strong overlay of conflict with extractive industries and resources. So many of these countries have bountiful resources, and trying to work out how they should be able to exploit them sustainably in such a way as it is an engine for growth and doesn't put them into the kind of resource curse and trap that we've seen in many other cases, and where the resources were often part of the originating discipline of the conflict, is very important. So the transparency around concessions, the transparency around how foreign direct investment comes into the country, the transparency around the revenues coming from the company to the government and then from the government to the people. Extremely sensitive issues in the best of times, even more sensitive and difficult in a post-conflict situation. These are absolute keys to success. Now, in most post-conflict countries, people don't have water, they don't have access to power, basic infrastructure's not there, roads don't work, you can't get your products to market even if you wanted to. And so the infrastructure issues become very important as well. So this is the kind of sequencing. But the lesson learned is you have to do this really from the get-go. You cannot sort of wait for some kind of public sector situation to exist before the private sector comes in. In Liberia, we started with requests from the Liberian government for advice on financial services, agriculture, infrastructure. We put in place some business environment reforms, helping the rules and regulations support the right kind of private sector growth. Very, very importantly, governments have to communicate to their people, we've put this reform in place. Things are going to get easier. You can get your products out of the port, out of the airport quicker. Communicating the reform is almost as important as the reform itself. And then I think we work very hard in the power sector, and I think that that's been quite some success. And now, in the teeth of this economic crisis, we have to make sure that trade finance is available so that small, medium-sized enterprises in Liberia can still be producing, can still be financed, and can still be part of a global economy. Now, commodity prices are not at a place where possibility is enhanced at the moment. Rubber prices, palm oil prices are low. This is going to put severe constraints on some of the options in front of the government. But building an industry that can be sustainable, even at this time, by reforming land and reforming some of the business regulation will be key in the teeth of an international crisis. So I think with what my final word would be enormous humility, boots on the ground, help the private sector come out of informality and be an engine of growth, and help from the small and micro up so that distribution and equity can be spread across a country riven by conflict in the first place. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you. Thanks for four very good presentations to get us started. One question that I had before we turn to the audience is how actually the three of you think about your support and working with the government relative to working with non-government organizations and institutions and racial, in your case it would be the private sector. On the one hand, obviously there's a desire to build up capacity in post-conflict settings and to provide support to the government. You want to be very supportive to the government. On the other hand, there's great capacity in non-government agencies and civil society agencies as well, and the interplay between the civil society agencies and the government is critically important for transparency and accountability. So I wanted to ask kind of how you think in each of your different, the different ways that you provide support, how you think about working with government relative to non-government and how that interacts, and then we'll come back to you at the end and ask how you see that, you know, in terms of the government, non-government interaction. Peter, do you want to start with that?
Well, you know, again, with the secretariat position, for us, it's all about the communication between the two. We're putting a lot of money into the non-government side, and for relatively little money, we can create the secretariat position or help support it, not create it, but help support it. And that will do wonders, I think, for the relationship between the two, and you know, just for new people coming in too, make them feel more comfortable with who's doing what, and how do I know my dollars are going to get effectively used, and is what I'm doing going to last? Is the government going to be interested in this and take it on in a particular ministry? So, you know, to me, it really is making sure the relationship is solid, because I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I can't imagine being a government with millions and millions of dollars going into your country and not necessarily it going into places that you want to see it go. I mean, that's got to be one of the most frustrating things for any government, to have to deal with that. So to have the relationship there, I think, is the critical piece.
Mm-hmm. Good. Olara, how do you see that?
Well, the leadership and cooperation of the government, in the case of schools, the Ministry of Education is important. The Ministry of Education provides a national curriculum, and that has to be followed by everybody. They inspect schools to make sure they meet certain standards and certify and accredit. And they provide teachers for the school. But unlike in the past, where most of the schools were built and supported by the government, we've seen radical degradation of schools in rural areas and in poor communities. And alongside that, the general neglect of the public schools system and the mushrooming of really upscale private schools for the relatively well-to-do. So the investment now is going into private schools. It is partly why one cannot wait for the government at some stage to be ready to build a school in community X. And one has to link up directly with the community, make it a community initiative, independent initiative, but hooked up to the Ministry of Education and the government system. Take teachers, for example. Teachers will be provided by the government. But unless there are some incentives built by the local community, the best teachers are likely to migrate from the rural, poor communities to the private schools. So in addition to the government providing them, one has to work out locally what would make it possible to retain the good teachers in that community.
Good, thank you. Rachel?
Well, I think that if I look at East Timor, I look at Rwanda, Bosnia, Liberia, Sierra Leone, DRC, Central African Republic, one of the first things we try to do, because it's demanded both from the private sector and the government, is try to support what we call public-private dialogue, which is something that we, or sitting here or in many of the countries where we come from, just take for granted, that there is an open way, structured and unstructured, for the government and the private sector to talk about what's working, what's not working. This doesn't exist, and many governments, especially in post-conflict, don't have the capacity to really manage that well. And so often we come in and sort of try to get that going and offer support for that conversation to happen, perhaps channeling that conversation into certain areas of the economy where both sides need progress to be made, and also use that as a forum for a communication about, okay, we're going to do this, it'll be done in the next 2 months, okay, it was done, that new administrative rule is in place. know, if I look in Cambodia, it's been enormously successful. In Timor, it's quite hard to get off the ground. In Liberia, it's working well. And actually, it's the first thing we're doing in Central African Republic. And so I think that this is, you know, people assume that the private sector can walk in through the door at any time. Well, that might be true in Washington, and it might be true in London or Frankfurt, but that space and the structure of that dialogue doesn't often exist in these countries, and that's the first thing that we would do on both sides of the aisle.
Steve, can I
Thanks.
add
Yes,
a small
please.
thing before the minister? In terms of innovating, in terms of seeking to establish a new model, a more effective impact model, governments are unlikely to blaze the trail. I think there one needs to work with the community, with philanthropists, with the private sector. They are more likely to want to innovate and to take certain risks. But once the model is established, the hope is that governments would then adopt it and generalize it because they see the impact. Similarly, multilateral institutions, others would then come on board and want to use this model more broadly.
Mr. Davis, how do you see that from your perspective, sitting in the government with lots of different folks coming in trying to help the support for the government, support for non-government actors, and for the interplay and communication between the two?
I think the short answer is effective leadership. Really, that's, and again, the key word, of course, being effective, because it's a question of leadership is not always a question of being in front and telling people do this, do that. It's also a question of listening. It's also a question of exploring what has worked in other environments and what can be adapted into your environment. Usually, you will find that immediately in a post-conflict or recovery period, because when the conflict took place, the response from the international community and from others outside was to an emergency response because the system of government had broken down. Usually when you get the government coming back and beginning to assert itself, the first thing the government starts to make issue about, oh, this is our responsibility, we're supposed to be doing this. And there's usually that tension between the government and between your non-state actors. The government say, oh, this is a state responsibility, so we should do it. But in most cases, the government doesn't have the capacity to do it. And you have to then focus to say, well, then, you know, where's the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is to get improve education to the people, to get drinking water to them, to get sanitation to them. And if you can do that through providing the leadership to the partnership, then you're getting your job done. It's not a question of you physically doing it to say government should do it, but can you provide the kind of leadership to do it? And one of the things that we continue to advocate early on in this administration, working along with our colleagues in government and the non-state actors, was that if we provide the kind of effective leadership, then it begins to build trust across the table. It begins we all start removing those barriers that we usually come to the table with. And once that's in, then we start working together a lot better and we start engaging better. So effective leadership is extremely critical, particularly early on, and to recognize that leadership, it's not a question of just giving instructions, but also listening and recognizing that others can do what you need to get done better than you can do it at the time, but at least from a government standpoint, you still need to try to provide that overall guidance and direction.
Great. Good. Thank you. Let's open it up to you folks. There are, I think, 3 or 4 roving microphones. So I ask that when I call on you that you please identify yourself and your affiliation. Make your question, hopefully a question, not a long speech. And if you would like, you can direct it to one or more of our panelists. Please, yes, sir. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's an enlightening panel. I want to point to Mr. Buffett.
Sorry, can you identify yourself, your name and your...
Neil Koch with Netherlands Development Organization. Coming back to the question again, you mentioned the need for the government, the private sector, and the social sector to work together. And I want to make a quick comment and ask a question on that one. From Netherlands Development Organization, we actually following a model called inclusive development with 3 pillars. One is inclusive business to engage the private sector. One is inclusive public policy to engage the public sector. We have done that in some countries where we have a minister of social inclusion and the social cohesion. My question to you is that given your discussion with the government, I know
No. I can't, no. I mean, it's a rare thing, I believe. I mean, that's what's so exciting about Liberia is that we are successfully working with the government in a way of coordination that I think, as the minister said, is pretty unique. Not that we can't work with specific ministries on certain things, like we were talking about education. You want to make sure that if you're working in the schools, that the ministry agrees with your approach. I mean, otherwise, what's the point? And or if they don't, you're trying to prove something in a small way, so they do. I mean, there's that as well. So absolutely, and I'm sure that's true in the health side, across all sorts of different sectors, that you obviously want the ministry engaged. I don't know if there's another example of sort of this secretariat position or a minister that's as enlightened as Mr. Davis is here, in terms of really understanding the relationship that needs to be established between what the NGOs are doing and what the government, what the needs are, and how to work together. So I don't have an example, and one of my colleagues here may say, well, no, actually, but I can certainly say that if we're working with girls, for instance, and we know that at the government level, there's no national identification system so that they can actually be tracked and proceed through the system correctly. We can identify issues that we have to work on advocacy or something, but in terms of a real relationship, this is unique.
I think that's true. I certainly don't know of any others. I don't know if any of the other panelists do or not, but I think the Secretariat is a new innovation in Liberia, and hopefully something that can be replicated in other places as well. Sir, up front, table number 3.
Luke Suman, I'm from Bangladesh. I had a small independent think tank called the Bangladesh Enterprise Institute. My question is to my old friend, Olara Otunnu, with whom I had the privilege of working together at the UN some 25, 26 years ago. Olara, you were involved with many years on behalf of the UN with the issue of children involved in armed conflicts. And you raised the issue about the importance of getting children back to school. The children who've, in many cases, been themselves involved in the conflict and have borne arms, how do you deal with their trauma and their experience? And I have a brief comment to make because Bangladesh has been actively involved in the UN peacekeeping process. The head of the UN peacekeeping forces in Liberia is Bangladeshi general, and we were very active in Sierra Leone also. One interesting experience was that peacekeeping and peace building go together. And when we speak about post-conflict situations, actually, we don't wait until the conflict is over in order to start certain activities, in particular, I would say, education and schooling or community building. We see this in Afghanistan, and I think this is one of the key features in trying to understand how to bring peace to Afghanistan, is the need to really address, while the conflict is still going on, the issue of peace building along with trying to arrest the conflict.
Thank you. Olara, would you like to respond?
Thank you, Farouk. A couple of quick observations. The first is that when the kids who've been involved directly in fighting as part of some fighting group, whatever their role, they were porters, they were intelligence officers, they were actually carrying the gun, it doesn't matter. One, is important when they're demobilized to try to reintegrate them within the community. Very important. That's not always easy to be accepted by their families and their relatives and the broader community. Second, it's so important to address their psychological needs. I spoke earlier of the more global psychological, spiritual needs of a community, a loss of confidence, a loss of self-reliance, the sense of dignity which has been so punctured. For these kids, similarly, the deep trauma. So one has to use whatever methods are available, I would say both ancient and modern. If traditionally there are capacities for addressing and making whole what has gone so radically wrong, by all means use that. If in addition modern methods of intervention are available, the capacity is there, use that, or some combination of. The trouble is that in most of these places, the traditional has been destroyed because of 10, 15, 20 years of war. The modern is not there. For example, in Sierra Leone, when I visited in the aftermath of war, not a single psychiatrist. Traditional healers, traditional people were all scattered and demoralized. Only one, I think, nurse, psychosocial or psychiatric nurse. Same in Afghanistan when I went and visited. So it's a big challenge. Finally, even the children who were involved in war, even those who were being shot and who killed, their biggest yearning is still to go to school once they have the opportunity. And from my point of view, we should be less concerned about the question of ages, of mixed ages within classes. I went to school not in a war situation, but in our class, primary 1, primary 6, there were various ages within the classroom. It didn't really matter at all, you know? So I wouldn't be so concerned about the ages. What is important, I think, is the psychological profiles which differ. But one has to find a way of somehow addressing this. And the best way, in my view, is not to have a separate intervention for the kids who've been involved in war, but to mix them with the other kids and then be on the watch for how to help them particularly, but within the broader ordinary schools.
Thank you. Other questions from the audience?
I will add to the conflict. Yeah, right. Well, it's actually part of, it's another answer to this. The other side of it is, I think that the conflict may end, but another big part of our investment in Liberia is violence against women, because the conflict doesn't end for women usually, because the behavior that was happening during the conflict towards the women somehow it feels like it's okay suddenly, and you can start to do things that you would otherwise think was unconscionable. And so, you know, my feeling is that a country isn't really stable until the women are safe and the girls can go to school. So that's just an important component, is that just as because the conflict is over, it doesn't mean some of the behavior doesn't continue. And the violence against women in some of these countries is extraordinary, and that's a big part of what we're doing.
In fact, I would add that, you know, I would state even stronger, that in fact the new social ills created in the context of war are very durable. They last a long time, and they last even longer. Why? Because the inhibitions which were in place, if you take, for example, violence against women, in many societies, there were very strong taboos, very, very strong taboos against some of the practices which we've now seen in situations of war. But because the society broke apart, the moral authority was completely destroyed, the elders have barely any role anymore, the gun was the ruler, the cultural context that called people to order has broken down. Right. And part of what we've got to address, in my view, whether in terms of protecting women, protecting children, other relations within society, is how to resuscitate the positive aspects of cultural and traditional practices which kept society within a certain balance and which has broken. That should be part of our agenda.
So one of the pernicious problems for women preceding all of these conflicts is in many of these countries, They had no legal access to collateralized assets. And often, even if they had legal, they had customary barriers. So you can't get a business loan if you can't collateralize, land or jewelry, or I mean, it doesn't have to be a fixed asset. And so, one of the opportunities for sort of a leapfrogging reform in a post-conflict situation is to get that sorted out. These legal codes are over 100 years old. And so what you see is that in certain countries, we've calculated that the country is losing 2 to 3% of GDP growth a year by not letting women actually get their businesses going. And in Africa, almost 70% of small, medium-sized business owners are women. So if they're informalized and they can't collateralize and they can't grow, then imagine how much growth you can, it's sitting there in the country. This isn't about bringing in aid or bringing in foreign direct investment. This is just liberating what's already there.
Let me ask, we've sort of talked a bit around this, but for philanthropists or private investors or people working with NGOs, how do you think about the key differences working in a post-conflict situation relative to other low-income countries that also may have capacity problems and other issues, but not post-conflict? What are the key distinctions in a post-conflict setting, both in terms of the substance of how you direct, what activities you're funding and working on, but also how you approach the situation with your staff and with the questions you ask? What are the key distinctions for working in these situations relative to others? Peter?
Well, I would say probably the first thing is that broken fabric of cultural relationships, I think, and that probably spreads across all sorts of different definitions, but just the breakdown of the communities and the practices that went on, and again, how that resonates. And probably the other thing would be the infrastructure. Now, certainly many poor countries don't have great infrastructure, but it's different to feel like there's something you can build as opposed to something that was there and was destroyed and you have to start over. It's a whole different dilemma, I think, for the mind. And frankly, then the other is the mind, the psychological state of the individual and the community and the country.
Olara, how do you see that?
I'd say that one is this spiritual, psychological disability created by the war. Two, the kind of dislocation which has removed all taboos and inhibition, the positive taboos from society, so that there's no moral authority, anything goes. It's a terrible legacy of war. And then I would say that also in post-conflict situation, you've got the opportunity for transformation in a way which you didn't have before conflict. One good example is just what you cited. In, say, many African countries, women don't inherit land or property, and therefore they don't have direct access. They must go through their sons or their husbands or their brothers-in-law. They can't go directly. But in a post-conflict situation, precisely because of the nature of that situation where everything is in a flux, you can in fact address that. As we've seen with the example of Rwanda, we worked with the Rwandese government and successfully was able to put in place a legislation correcting that, and now we're trying to see if this can be generalized, replicated elsewhere. So in a way, there are mostly maybe it is negative and more daunting than before conflict, but also it presents opportunities which one didn't have before conflict.
I think that's right. It's both the challenge and the opportunity. The problem is that a lot of the institutions have been destroyed, and the opportunity is that a lot of institutions have been destroyed, and you have the opportunity to really start and make them more effective. Rachel?
Well, just by the way, one of the indigenous African banks that's understood that the future of its business is banking women, women's businesses at the bottom of the pyramid, is moving from Nigeria to Rwanda because this is the fastest growing women's business market in the continent. So it's out from crisis and risk to opportunity. I think that the one thing, and I've talked a lot about growing from the bottom up, the microfinance and SMEs, but when large investments come in, I think that the risk analysis is completely different in that you have to really think through, or you have to help the company and the government really think through, as the new investment comes in, often maybe to a state-owned enterprise or to a resource that's being left idle, is that everything that you do must not harken back to the reasons for the conflict in the first place. So are you hiring from the full breadth of the community? That you don't end up hiring from one ethnicity and not another? That nothing that you do in coming back in with an investment would actually perpetrate some of the reasons for the conflict in the first place. A very good example of this is Jacamine and the state-owned mining enterprises in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There you've got millions, literally millions of people who were officially on the payroll of a state-owned mining company. In fact, they weren't earning very much, and so they were, in some cases they became sort of marauding groups of people who were committing violence in order to be able to sustain themselves. But in order for that mining sector to be reformed sustainably, those enterprises have to be able to have working workforces, which means you're going to have to find alternative livelihoods for millions of those people who were actually on the formal payroll of the state-owned enterprise. That's an enormous set of issues for an investor coming in, even after the mining law has been completely rewritten. So how do you work with that? These are the kinds of completely different sets of risk analysis and opportunities for supply chains, etc., that have to be thought through in a post-conflict situation.
If I can just say from a government's lens, I think one critical element there is time. Where from the standpoint of a government, particularly in post-conflict, it's hard to generalize because you have so many different types of post-conflict experiences. But it's time in that you're managing so many different moving parts at one time. You talk about transformation, but equally so as you talk about a democratic process, you have to appreciate that if you had an elections, and there's a good chance the legislature that you need to be the one that actually will approve those reform acts, and so they themselves may have been part of the conflict, and they themselves therefore may not be inclined to authorize some of those reforms that you're trying to bring about, because of course there are their own issues in terms of where some of their different issues and small agendas may lie. Again, it's also a question of the structure of what you meet within the government apparatus. Liberia, again, is such an interesting situation because Ellen Johnson's administration actually has a minority rule in the legislature. So again, you're constantly then trying to make sure you're able to move bills and acts across, but equally so is that time is also then the citizenry that now they want to see things improve overnight, and therefore what is it, those expectations, and how do you manage those expectations? So there's so many different moving parts, and that's why it was very important to us to recognize the different components of partnerships. You have your multilateral partnerships, your bilateral partnerships, which bring about a certain kind of assistance to you, but equally so you also need your NGO partnerships and also your philanthropic and your foundation partnership, because it allows you then to put those different components of pieces together that can probably get a better whole. They're able to be more responsive in a very quick way, as opposed to bilateral partners that have to turn around and do all of the assessment. They have to go through their procurement process and things like that, and it will eventually come, but how do you bridge that gap and buy that time? And that's why it has been so critical for us to put in place a mechanism that we can try to exploit in terms of managing those relationships and being able to achieve our goals.
Steve, can I make a small plea? I would say that all of us need to pay much more attention to the issue of cultural loss, the loss of cultural patrimony, and the need for recovery of that. Secondly, I'm often disturbed by the assumption that we tend to have at the international level that tradition and traditional practices are, of course, retrogressive. God knows there are practices which are retrogressive, like the example of what you do with properties and whether women have access or not. And we should take the opportunity to transform and change that. But there are also a whole wealth of practices which are protective, which are positive, which encourage respect and dignity and self-confidence in our people. And we should reach deep in that well and draw from it as well.
That's right. Good. Thank you very much. I think at this point we want to move on to our next session, which will be a conversation with Jane Wales and Muhammad Yunus. I want you to stay where you are. They're just going to move things around up here for a minute, but we can move smoothly into the next session. But before you go, I please want you to join me in thanking our panelists, Rachel Kyte, Honorable Natty Davis, Olara Otunnu, and Peter Buffett. Thank you very much.